The equipment that we'll need for making these loaf bread recipes includes dry and liquid measuring cups, measuring spoons. You might find a Wonder Cup handy if you have one. We're going to need a large mixing bowl, a medium mixing bowl. We'll need an electric mixer, a straight edge spatula, a rubber scraper, a wire whisk, a wooden spoon, some custard cups. We'll need loaf pans, the proper size for the recipe, and cooking spray. And then additionally, I prefer to use parchment paper as well for lining the pans. Before I start measuring or mixing any of my ingredients, I want to make sure that my oven is preheated and my pan is prepared and ready for the batter when I'm finished mixing, because I don't want it to be sitting around waiting for the pan to get prepared. And the reason for that is, as a quick bread, it's important to get the batter into the oven as soon as you're finished with it. We don't want the baking powder or the baking soda to release its carbon dioxide before the product is in the oven. So I'm going to spray my loaf pans with cooking spray. Trying to keep the sides fairly clean of cooking spray, a little towards the bottom wouldn't be bad, but we want it to be able to kind of cling to the side of the pan as it rises to get that nice domed look towards the top. But then I also like to, in addition, on my loaf pans, I like to line the bottom with parchment paper. It just makes it a little bit easier to ensure that the product comes out of the pan. And this is especially helpful if your quick bread has anything in it like nuts or chips, because those tend to stick to the bottom of the pan. And then the bread gets kind of torn up in the process of turning it out of the pan. So I'm going to trim these up to fit just inside the bottom of my pan. This particular brand of parchment paper is nice. It has some lines that help to guide it. And then the cooking spray is nice because it kind of helps it to stay in place as you place it in the bottom of the pan. So there's my first one. There's my second pan ready to go. To make our chocolate quick bread, we'll need flour, sugar, cocoa, both baking powder and baking soda, salt, buttermilk, butter, eggs, and chocolate chips. When I get ready to make a quick bread that has alternate adding ingredients, I need to keep in mind where all of my ingredients will end up eventually. And that will be in the bowl that starts with the solid fat and the sugar. So I'm going to save my largest bowl for that, and I'm going to go ahead and measure my dry ingredients and place them in a medium bowl, and then I'll sift those together with a wire whisk. So the first thing I need to measure is flour, and originally this recipe calls for 1.5 cups of flour, but I'm going to double this recipe. A lot of the time when I make quick breads, I will double recipe because 2 loaf pans typically fit easily into an oven, and for the most part it doesn't take that much more time. Notice I'm stirring my flour around, and then I spoon it into the measuring cup so that it heaps over and I level it off. I stir it around to kind of aerate it. And then I put it in there so that I don't pack it. And then I level it off. You do not want to ever scoop up your flour because that'll pack it in to the measuring cup and you'll end up with too much flour in your recipe. So now, in addition to the flour, I need a 1/2 cup of cocoa. And I'm going to do that twice because the 1/2 cup fits in here and the 1 cup doesn't. Now this one I can scoop up and that's fine. But I want to do that so that it heaps over the top. And then very carefully, I'm going to use that straight edge to get all that cocoa out of there. Then I'm going to do that again. So that I get a nice full measure of cocoa. Let's see. Sometimes you have to backfill your dry measuring cups. Make sure I have it so it heaps over the top. And there's all the cocoa that I need for this recipe. Next, I'm going to add a teaspoon of salt. Salt is easily scooped up, heaped over, leveled off, and put in. The next ingredient on my list is baking powder, and I need a teaspoon of that as well. So there's my baking powder right next to my salt. And I need baking soda next. So both baking powder and baking soda are chemical leavening agents. And they are what make these breads rise. And they do that in a fast manner, which is why they're called quick breads. These chemical leaveners are faster than yeast breads. So there's my teaspoon of baking soda as well. So if I want to double check, I can see the flour, the cocoa, the salt, the baking powder, the baking soda. So you might be wondering what's the difference between baking soda and baking powder. And the difference is that baking soda is one ingredient in baking powder. So baking powder has baking soda, an acidic ingredient to help it do its job, and that's cream of tartar, and then also an inert ingredient to keep them stable while they're stored, and that's typically cornstarch. So now, anytime a recipe tells me to sift together dry ingredients, I like to just use a whisk in the bowl. And I like the whisk for 3 reasons. It adds air, it eliminates lumps, and it mixes thoroughly. So I'm just going to mix this till it's one nice homogeneous color. And I don't really see lighter areas of just flour and darker areas of concentrated cocoa. And eliminating lumps is really important in this particular recipe because both the cocoa and the baking soda have a tendency to form lumps. So we want to eliminate those if at all possible before putting our bread in the oven. So there's my dry ingredients, and now I'm going to set that bowl aside and work on the next bowl. As I mentioned, all of my ingredients are going to end up in the bowl where my solid fat and sugar start out. So I want to make sure I keep that in mind and make that my largest bowl so I don't have to keep moving things. So now I need to measure my granulated sugar. And to do that, I simply scoop up the sugar in the measuring cup so that it heaps over the top, and I level it off. And so for this doubled recipe, I need 2 cups of sugar. And then shortly I'll be adding eggs to this. But before that, I want to beat these 2 ingredients until they're creamy. Now that my butter and sugar are starting to come back together, it's time to add the eggs. And we're going to add them one at a time, beating well after each addition. And I always crack my eggs into a custard cup before I add them to my dish for a couple of reasons. Number one, if some shell gets in there, it's a lot easier to fish out of a small custard cup than it is out of the mixing bowl. But less often, but more importantly, if there's a problem with the egg, all I would have to do is replace the egg and not all of the ingredients in my bowl. So always when you're using a hand mixer, put it in before you turn it on and turn it off before you move it out. Now that I've added all my eggs, I need to just measure one more ingredient to mix all the ingredients together, and that's my buttermilk. So I have a 2-cup liquid measuring cup here, and I'm going to shake the buttermilk before I open it because it can sometimes separate a little bit as it sits. And the original recipe calls for 1 cup, so I need 2. And that's all of the liquids in this recipe. So my liquid measuring cup is going to be my bowl, essentially, for my liquids. And I want to stoop down at eye level and check that measurement and make sure it's right at that 2-cup or 16-ounce mark. Now, the important part of knowing how to treat a recipe when it tells you to add alternately or alternate adding ingredients. Basically, I'm starting out with 3 bowls. I have my bowl with my fat and solid fat and sugar mixed together that I've added my eggs to. I have my bowl with my dry ingredients that I've sifted, and I have my liquid. So now instead of the hand mixer, I'm going to use a wooden spoon so that I don't over mix my quick bread. Because when I over mix it, it can cause holes and tunnels to form, as well as making my bread tough instead of tender and soft and crumbly. So to do this, I've separately combined my 3 entities. And now I'm going to take about 1/3 of my dry ingredients. I'm just kind of estimating about 1/3 of what's in the bowl, and I'm going to stir that in to that butter, sugar, egg mixture just until I really don't see dry, powdery ingredient floating around. And again, this is with a wooden spoon so that I don't over mix it. Which is why as soon as I get to this point where I don't see any dry powdery ingredient, I'm going to add about 1/3 of the buttermilk in my measuring cup. And then I'm going to stir that in. Now it's important that I do it this way for a couple reasons. It actually avoids over mixing. It's actually easier to mix it in these stages than if I poured all the dry in and then all the buttermilk in. So now that I don't see any loose buttermilk, the next third, the second third of the dry ingredient in that bowl, I'm going to stir that in. It also helps, stirring it in this way, helps to make sure it doesn't become a big mess all over my counter. And you really have, to get your bread to turn out right, you really have to mix it together this way when the recipe calls for it. I've seen the results of people who dump all the dry in and then all the liquids, or all the liquids and then all the dry, and it makes a much tougher bread. And that is not a desirable quality in a quick bread. So here's my second third of liquid. Just mix that gently until it's in. You can see this is a very thick batter that this bread makes. Just until I don't really see buttermilk in the bowl. Then I'm going to add that last third of dry ingredients. Make sure it all gets in there. So we have the proper balance of ingredients so everything turns out right. We're going to stir that in. Again, just until moistened, just until we don't see those dry ingredients floating around in the mixture. And then we'll add our last third of liquids, and in this recipe that's buttermilk. And this time, because it's the end of the cup, I am going to scrape. Again, making sure all that ingredient gets into the recipe so it turns out correctly. Baking is quite a balance of chemical reactions amongst the ingredients. So it's really important that you get it to get them to turn out just right, that you get all of those ingredients in the bowl. So once I finished mixing this together, I'll be ready to move the batter to my pans. Now I'm going to spoon the batter between my two pans and try to make sure that they're even. If I wanted to be accurate and very precise, then I could do this by weight. I would put one of the pans on my scale, zero it out, so that I had the tare weight and weighed only the batter. So I'm just going to put this in the pan. Dividing it evenly until I have everything out of the mixing bowl. One last step before I put these in the oven. Now you can wait about 20 minutes if you want to do this and then add the chips. But I find that to work out just fine if I go ahead and add them at the beginning. And I do prefer to use mini chocolate chips instead of regular full-size one. But it gets 1/4 cup of chips added to the top of the bread. And then they'll bake in and hold to the bread whether you start at the beginning or 20 minutes into the bake time. So now these are going to go into a 350-degree oven for about 50 minutes. And I'll know that they're finished when a toothpick inserted in the center comes out clean. One thing I want to mention that's also important is when I put these in the oven, I want to make sure that there's at least 2 inches of space between them and 2 inches away from the walls of the oven. I want the air to circulate well around my pans, and that's the way to make sure that happens. Pans should never be placed in the oven next to each other because that blocks all that air circulating between and they won't bake as evenly. So you always want to have 2 inches between any pans and the walls of the ovens when you place your baked products into the oven for preparation. To make our lemon loaf, we will need flour, sugar, butter, sour cream, eggs, lemon zest. We'll also need baking soda, vanilla extract, lemon extract, salt, and then we'll need some powdered sugar, additional lemon zest, and lemon juice for the icing that coats the top. Before I get too far into measuring ingredients for my lemon loaf, I want to get that lemon zested. So you could use a zester, or what I have is a microplane grater. I like it because it does makes a finer zest, so it mixes in really nicely. It kind of gets caught on the underside, but I can just tap it and it drops right into my container. Whenever you're zesting citrus fruits, make sure that you don't go too far past the color, because that white part is called the pith and it's very bitter. So you can see I've gotten about all of the zest I can get off of this lemon. And I've got it all right here where I can measure it easily for both parts of my recipe. Now I need to juice the lemon. To juice the lemon, I've cut it in half, across the middle, not top to bottom, so I get this wagon wheel look. And I've placed my juicer over a custard cup to catch the juice. I put the center of the lemon on the pointed part of the juicer, that's called the reamer. And then I push and twist to get the juice out, so that I essentially go from this to this. And the juice is in the custard cup. I can measure from there, and the juicer has caught any pulp or seeds. So now that we've prepared the parts of the lemon, we'll go ahead and move on to the main steps of mixing together our lemon loaf. And we'll sift together the dry ingredients into their own medium mixing bowl. And again, this recipe has us alternately add ingredients. Like many batter recipes, it calls for the dry and wet ingredients to be added alternately into a creamy butter or solid fat like shortening and eggs. And then alternately means the dry and the wet divided into 2 or 3 batches and added one at a time. First the dry, then the wet, then the dry, and so on until everything's well incorporated. And then, as I mentioned in the previous recipe preparation, it also helps to avoid a mess. So for our lemon loaf, we are going to put together flour, salt, baking soda. Flour, salt, and baking soda in our dry ingredients bowl. Now that I've sifted together the dry ingredients, I'll set this bowl aside and begin to cream together the butter and sugar. Now this recipe would like to put the lemon extract, vanilla extract, and lemon zest in with the eggs and sugar. And then once those 3 items are added, we'll beat them in until it's smooth and well blended. Now we'll set this aside while we prepare the liquid, or in this case dairy ingredients, to alternate with the dry. So rather than using buttermilk, this recipe uses a different thick cultured dairy product, and it uses sour cream instead. And so we're going to alternate adding the dry ingredients with the sour cream. So once again, we're going to put about 1/3 of those dry ingredients into the bowl that has the solid fat and sugar. In this recipe, our solid fat was butter. Usually quick breads use a liquid fat like oil or a melted butter or margarine. And it's that solid fat that creates the necessity for mixing it this way instead of using the traditional muffin method. So there, my dry is mostly mixed in. I'm going to put about 1/3 of my sour cream in. And I measured that in the Wonder Cup. If you did not have a Wonder Cup, you would want to measure this in a dry measuring cup. Because really a Wonder Cup's just a fancy deluxe dry measuring cup. So that's mixed in. Now the second third of our dry ingredients, we're just estimating. And then we want to make sure our oven is nice and hot and our pans are prepared ahead. So that way, as soon as this is ready, it goes in the oven. Because as soon as baking soda comes in contact with liquid, it begins to release that carbon dioxide. And we want to trap as much of that as possible because that's what makes our bread rise. So there's our next third of our sour cream, which will loosen our batter up nicely to get that last third of dry ingredients in. Tap, make sure we get it all in there. Carefully mix this in. And then once we don't see too much dry left, we'll add that last bit of sour cream. Mix that in. We'll be ready to divide it into our pans. Remember, I doubled this recipe. The original recipe just creates 1 loaf. So this is a really thick batter. It may be hard to move into the pan. And then you may want to tap it down before you put it in the oven. This is going to bake at 350 for 45 to 55 minutes. Always remember to set your timer for the lowest amount of time. While my bread is baking, I'm going to mix up the icing that'll go on top of the bread after it's cooled. So to do that, I need 3/4 cup of powdered sugar for each loaf. So I'm going to measure that with a 1/2 cup and a 1/4 cup. Most standard sets do not have a 3/4, so it's important to remember how to do that. You can also use the 1/4 cup 3 times. And it's measured just like flour. So to my powdered sugar, I'm going to add a 1/2 teaspoon of lemon zest and 1 tablespoon of lemon juice. And then I'll just stir that together with a fork until it's a nice consistency. If it's a little dry, I can add a few drops of lemon juice. If it's extremely runny, then I can add a little bit of powdered sugar. But either adjustment that you might make should be done slowly. We just want it to drizzle onto the top of our loaf and then stay in place. To make our banana bread, we'll need some very ripe bananas, flour, sugar, shortening, salt, baking powder and baking soda, eggs, buttermilk, and vanilla extract. we have the results of our 3 recipes of loaf breads. A variety of ways, all came out great because we alternated the ingredients properly as we mixed the recipe together. Make sure that when you see that step in a recipe, you remember the process and how to add part of the dry to the fat and sugar mixture, and then part of the liquids, repeating until it's all combined into one homogeneous mixture.